Hi, I'm Bridget O'Brien, and in this PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to be discussing domestic violence in New Mexico and how impactful their community organizations and services are. I'm also going to be going into how these community organizations and services can be improved in New Mexico. First, it's important to understand what domestic violence is and what domestic violence services are. Domestic violence is usually carried out in interpersonal relationships and/or cohabitational relationships. There are many different forms of abuse and violence, such as rape, sexual harassment, and verbal abuse. Many people in New Mexico suffer from domestic violence. Services and organizations benefit victims and survivors in many ways. These include hotlines, shelters, advocacy centers, as well as counseling. Domestic violence organizations have impacted victims and survivors of domestic violence in the past in a very positive light. They often increase feelings of empowerment and security in those that have experienced domestic violence. Victims are also more likely to seek and follow through with legal remedies. And shelters usually reduce likeliness that these survivors will be abused again. Lastly, these services provide resources for self-advocacy. How can these domestic violence organizations and services increase in effectiveness? Well, how are the organizations for domestic violence held back? In some ways, they're limited in documentation and evaluation. This is usually from the government as well as private funding, and government commitment to organizations and social issues, as well as social justice. Domestic violence organizations are held back in documentation specifically in that some organizations cannot cater to women that do not have proper documentation.
Thus, these women cannot find refuge or get help with domestic violence organizations.
In order to improve the impactfulness of domestic violence organizations and services in New Mexico, it's important to follow through with a few proposal steps. The first step would be to explore funding options from the government and create a domestic violence organization coalition. Coalitions usually have much more leeway when it comes to funding from the government. The second step would be to propose government funding sources consider lifting their constraints. And the last step would be to emphasize to these sources the relevance of domestic violence services in New Mexico. It's important that our community understand the importance of improving these organizations. To be more specific about this proposal, it will be worthwhile to contact the United States Department of Justice, in specific to New Mexico, and the Office on Violence Against Women, also known as OVW. The Office on Violence Against Women is a program that gives different organizations that carry out domestic violence services grants and fund their different programs. It would be important to acquire upon these grant programs restrictions in New Mexico. Also, it will be important to propose an increase in flexibility for organizations with this grant and who can benefit from these services. This may have to do with different documentation restrictions, as mentioned above. Also, it's very important to contact the New Mexico governor. You can propose to the governor for an increase in flexibility for organizations as well as proper funding. If more people petition to the governor of New Mexico to improve domestic violence organizations and services and their funding, awareness around the issue may become more pertinent to the public eye. What are some of the costs and benefits of this proposal? Some of the costs may include that changing government contracts and constraints can take a substantial amount of time to negotiate and implement. Therefore, the impact of different organizations and services may not be able to increase in a short period of time. Also, working with government funding may impose substantial costs on managers and workers. However, the benefits outweigh the costs. Increased flexibility with domestic violence programs and services will be brought about once this proposal is carried through. Government funding is often reliable and professional as well when it comes to nonprofit organizations, which most domestic violence programs are. Also, the government and community may respond to the issues of domestic violence in New Mexico more when they understand how much more the government is working to collaborate with different domestic violence programs. In conclusion, the effect of domestic violence organizations and services are tremendous in their impact and importance when it comes to victims and survivors of such crimes. However, improvements can be made when it comes to funding organizations and government restrictions. There needs to be more funding and less restrictions when it comes to these organizations. When lifting the funding constraints, the flexibility of organizations and their impact can be stronger and increase. Following through with this proposal will help the community and government further address the issues of domestic violence. Thank you for watching this presentation, and please consider making the necessary steps it takes to make domestic violence organizations and services more impactful for those who really need it.